Greetings to all scarf-wearing, sonic-wielding listeners out there, and welcome to the Doctor Who Club of Australia Book Club podcast. For those who came in late, the DWCA Book Club started back in 2016 when fans were suffering a year without a full season of the show. Hungry for stories, we turned our attention instead to the wealth of books at our disposal. It is not without reason that writer Robert Smith described Doctor Who as the most researched show on television, and that Paul Kirkley started his book, Space Helmet for a Cow, with the statement, "There have been millions upon millions of words written on the subject of Doctor Who, surely a contender for the most analysed television programme of all time." With this in mind, the selections for the book club have remained broad. The first meeting had attendees bringing in their own favourite Doctor Who books, which included Simon Guerrier's first Doctor novel, The Time Travellers, Fourth Doctor Tom Baker's autobiography, the collected Sixth Doctor comics and graphic novel Voyager, Jenny T. Colgan's 10th Doctor novel In the Blood, and the classic series Target novelisation of Talons of Weng-Chiang. Books chosen since then for discussion have included Time Unincorporated Volume 2, Legends of Ashildr, Sharda, and the graphic novel Weapons of Past Destruction. Today we're talking about George Mann's War Doctor novel Engines of War. Mann, of course, had already proven his Doctor Who ability with the 2010 audio short story The Parallax Effect for Big Finish, and the 2011 BBC Books release Paradox Lost, but of course the War Doctor presents new territory to explore. I've been reading a bit about war lately, or at least the ideas that fuel wars. Considering the recent rise in the popularity of fascist thinking, showcased by figures such as Donald Trump and Pauline Hanson, I was curious to read the ultimate example of such an approach and delved into Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf. His approach of blaming a particular group of people for all of society's woes was obviously seductive in its day, and would seem to be no less powerful now in some walks of life. An instructive companion volume that I read alongside it was Rudolf Hess's autobiography, Commandant of Auschwitz, which detailed how he set up and ran the concentration camp, including his shockingly matter-of-fact descriptions of industrialized murder and horror on a scale unimaginable, all justified by him as having been done due to a need to follow orders. Engines of War is significantly less heavy to read than either of those two tomes, but it seemed an appropriate continuation of my war-reading theme, especially since the Daleks were based on the Nazis, even seen performing the trademark salute with their plunger arms in Dalek Invasion of Earth, and shouting "Exterminieren, Exterminieren" in Journey's End. They are the ultimate fictional representation of racial hatred, and the most appropriate threat for the long-suggested, now finally glimpsed, Time War. I was already immersing myself in the first two War Doctor box sets from Big Finish in the aftermath of John Hurt's tragic demise, before starting to read Engines of War. His performance as the War Doctor on television and audio is superb, and the character he brought to life thus provides a strong template and genuine voice that rings true throughout the novel. The thing that kept surprising me throughout is the realization that he is still the Doctor. It is surprising, perhaps, because of the fact that the Doctor himself judges his warrior incarnation harshly as not worthy of the title. True, he takes a more pragmatic approach and will not shy away from taking lives if necessary. He fights not for Gallifrey, but for the people of the universe, caught in the crossfire of the war. He can be more extreme than the Doctor we know, but not overly so, certainly not so much that he is unrecognisable. He is no Valeyard, and the Seventh Doctor already went to some extremes himself without breaking the mould. The War Doctor is the Doctor, even if he won't call himself that. Engines of War is in many ways a greatest hits story in terms of the Dalek images it uses. There are the abandoned streets of an invaded world from Dalek Invasion of Earth, the breeding tanks of Genesis of the Daleks, the glass Dalek from Revelation of the Daleks, and the spaceship parked in a school playground from Remembrance of the Daleks. Just as Remembrance introduced the Special Weapons Dalek, this book delights in inventing a whole army of Dalek variations, including degradations from different possible timelines and beyond. The scale of the story is vast, with fleets of TARDISes and invaded planets and weapons forged from moons powered by temporal phenomena with the potential to erase Gallifrey from history. It has been tethered to the familiar by revisiting locations from such classic stories as The Five Doctors, but not in a continuity-heavy way. The descriptions are there for those who are in the know to recognise them, but the story operates as its own independent beast, able to be appreciated on its own terms, even if the reader is unfamiliar with the minutiae of Doctor Who continuity. At its heart, Engines of War is an anti-war story, as are all the War Doctor tales. The War Doctor balances himself between two juggernauts, desperately searching for a way to end hostilities and save lives, taking weapons from both Daleks and Time Lords alike in his struggle to save the innocent. I am very glad this book was written, as, like the Big Finish box sets, it expands on a part of the Doctor's history that was far too briefly glimpsed. We are lucky to have the video and audio performances of John Hurt to enjoy time and again, reliving the glory of the War Doctor. I just hope that more novels like this continue to expand on the legend of the Doctor that fought the Time War, as I certainly enjoyed this book. As I said before, it was much lighter reading than what I'd looked at immediately before it, but the essential message is no different from any tale of war. It is the innocent that suffer in times of conflict, and eventually someone needs to shout, "No more." But don't just take my word for it, let's hear from some other readers on the novel. The following review was written by Daniel Worsley. He wrote, "Yes, War Doctor. It acts as a prelude prequel to The Day of the Doctor, in which we see what inspires him to say no more, and it's unsettling. In fact, it'd inspire any of the Doctors to take radical action. How is the War Doctor different to any of the other Doctors, you may ask? Basically, he takes the end justifies the means attitude, an approach where some corners of the universe, they must be fought attitude, and he moulds this dark motivation into one little ball of barely contained fury. A standout moment sees him jumping onto a table and marching down it towards a Time Lord with an "I'm going to murder you" expression on his face, which worries someone who has known the Doctor for years. He genuinely thinks the War Doctor will throttle the Time Lord. There's a reference to the famous "Do I have the right" scene, where he says effectively, "I was wrong," and then proceeds to blow up the Dalek factory he's in. But importantly, you do get a sense of an innate doctorishness about him. His curiosity is still easily piqued, and his sense of justice is still there. In fact, it is his sense of justice which ultimately drives him to say no more. Throughout the story, however, there is an underlying impression that although he's not the Doctor, he once used to be, and deep down, he wants to be the Doctor again, and one day he will return to being that person. The following review was written by Richard Lipp. He wrote, "The other Doctor, the War Doctor, the John Hurt Doctor, the arguments, disagreements, and sheer frustration he seems to cause. I should put my cards on the table and admit I thought the concept worked. I liked that it wasn't the 8th Doctor who fought the Time War, and I preferred that the 9th Doctor was, apparently, new to life when we first saw him in Rose. As such, this may have coloured the way I read this first original novel for the War Doctor, because, honestly, I loved it." While I agree with Stephen Moffat's logic for not expanding on the War Doctor outside of one episode, that the show needs to focus on the present, what this novel shows is how interesting a character John Hurt had created in what was, honestly, a very small amount of time on screen, and the potential that the character has in terms of future, or should that be past, adventures. Of course, the novel was not written by John Hurt, so the author George Mann deserves kudos for making it feel as though we are inside the head of this lost incarnation on each and every page. More so, while the War Doctor refuses to use the Doctor as his name throughout the novel, this feels like the Doctor we are reading about and following on his journey. The novel could be criticised for being too similar to The Day of the Doctor, with lots of Dalek battles and Time War shenanigans. That criticism is not invalid. However, for a first novel featuring the War Doctor, I think this makes sense. You want to read about the character we saw all too briefly on screen, not an odd extension of him that you can't imagine being played by John Hurt. Of particular note is the aligning of continuities from the TV series, with the Doctor interacting with Rassilon, as last seen in The End of Time. These are some of the best pages in the novel, and you can truly imagine the power on screen of Timothy Dalton versus John Hurt if this was a film story. George Mann has again captured these characters perfectly. However, George Mann's original creations, particularly his pseudo-companion for the War Doctor, Cinder, deserves just as much kudos. While those who know me know I'm a big old teddy bear, I was caught by surprise when I shed a few tears towards the end of the novel. There can be no greater satisfaction for an author to know that a character they created felt so alive that I mourn their ending. All in all, this was a better than anticipated first novel starring the War Doctor. If there is a follow-up, though, I hope we get to see what this incarnation was like at the start of his life, now that we have seen two versions at the end of it. That's it for reviews of this book, but we'd still like to hear what you thought, particularly for the next meeting. The 7th book the Doctor Who Club of Australia Book Club will be reading is Plague City by Jonathan Morris. The book is to feature the 12th Doctor, Bill and Nardole, and has been described thus in the pre-release blurb. The year is 1645, and Edinburgh is in the grip of the worst plague in its history. Nobody knows who will be the next to succumb. Nobody except the Night Doctor, a masked figure that stalks the streets, seeking out those who will not live to see another day. But death is not the end. The Doctor, Bill and Nardole discover that the living are being haunted by the recently departed, by ghosts that do not know they are dead. And there are other creatures lurking in the shadows, slithering, creeping creatures filled with an insatiable hunger. The Doctor and his friends must face the terrifying secret of the Street of Sorrows, that something, which has lain dormant for 200 million years, is due to destroy the entire city. The book is due for release in Australia on the 1st of May, and the next book club meeting is set to occur on the 2nd of June. And we'd love to hear from you, either with written reviews or with audio files of yourself, or even in conversation with others at a book club meeting. If we like what we hear, we'll feature it in the next book club podcast. Send written or audio reviews and discussions through to publications@doctorwhoaustralia.org. Finally, before I go, here is an extract from an interview with Club President Lauren Davis and actor Richard Unwin from a recent Doctor Who Club of Australia event. Richard may not have voiced the Daleks, but as you'll hear, his recreation of the monoids from First Doctor story The Ark for the Big Finish audio Kingdom of the Blind brought him surprisingly close.
Yeah. So how many times did you watch The Ark to perfect the monoid?
I did, obviously. I watched it. And you know, it's funny that, because the monoids were originally done by Roy Skelton, who was one of the first Daleks. And if you take because there is an electronic effect on it, if you take the effect off, it's basically the same as he did for the first Daleks. So, and when I'm doing it in studio, I can't hear the electronic effect. So it's go to the security kitchen. And it's not until you put the effect on that it becomes a monoid.
Oh.
And because in the lunch break, Lisa said, you do sound a lot like a Dalek. I said, I know, wait for the effect. Because that's what Roy Skelton did back in the day.
I have actually been asked by someone who couldn't be here tonight, was Lisa Bowerman actually peeling potatoes in the scene in the security kitchen?
She wasn't. But when we did that, because Lisa's singing, it's a peeling we shall go, and I was supposed to be interrupting her. And Gary wanted us to do it in 2 separate takes, but we insisted on doing it together, and it worked, and I'm glad we did. Yeah, there was a good bit of collaboration. I don't know, this might be nonsense if you haven't heard the CD, but I recommend that you do. It's still available from Big Finish.
And then you participated again when you came back for Gallifrey.
That was a funny one, because I think it was near the end of Gary's time at Big Finish, and he asked pretty much everyone he'd employed to come back and do tiny bits in Gallifrey, which normally you'd have got 1 or 2 actors to do all these, it was like Chancery Guard. What was I in that?
Ambassador Twos.
I was a Tsunari, yes, yeah. Ambassador Twos. But because it was kind of his, one of his last things, he invited everyone, his regular people, to come back and do little bits. So it was a really crowded green room, but it was great fun. I remember walking in, and Louise Jameson, who obviously is in Gallifrey, the first thing she said to me was, would you sign my script? Because she was auctioning it for charity, so she wanted, I thought, Louise Jameson's asking me to sign the script. So that was weird. And Lalla Ward was on that one as well, and they were so like their characters. Louise was wandering around doling out herbal remedies. Lalla was sat at the back of the room reading a book on quantum physics or something. They were so like their characters. But lovely, both lovely.
That full interview will feature in the next issue of Data Extract, issue 235, due out in May, so make sure your membership is up to date to ensure you don't miss out. If you need to update your membership, or you just want to check out the latest news and upcoming DWCA events, go to dwca.org.au. Thanks very much for listening, and please tune in to the next Doctor Who Club of Australia Book Club podcast for Plague City. Until then.